جميل إذا بتحب تبلش.
Jamil, let's start. Good afternoon, and we welcome you all. Allow me to say that you can watch this session through our YouTube channel, through the English and Arab channels, and through our Facebook page, and you can make questions in the session meeting, in the different sessions yesterday and day for yesterday. There were important questions about yesterday, about the past and the future and the post-modernity, and that the pandemic had revealed several shortcomings that humanity is suffering, and in spite of the challenge that the humanity is facing that left much suffering, we hear some success stories, especially for those who are challenging this current situation, and this resisting reality gives some hope. This evening, this is the last session, we have a number of keynote speakers who contributed with their writings and their academic works and community works, maybe contributed to bringing back the smile to their followers and readers and students, which this conference is seeking for. In the first part of the session, which is titled The Features for the Future, we will have two keynote speakers, Dr. Gilbert Achcar and Dr. George Giacaman. Each speaker will have around 20 to 25 minutes to make a presentation. Then we will go to for the Q&A part of the session.
ستكون هناك
part of the session we will have concluding by Samuel Moyn to conclude our conference. I start with the first speaker, who's Dr. Gilbert Achcar, professor in development and international relations at London University, and he has several writings.
بل متى كان عالمنا يبتسم.
Rather, when our world was
للجيل الجديد أن يستعيد
smiling, and how the new generation had the ability to smile, and how.
شكرا عزيزي.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this presentation, and thank you for Muwatin's team for organizing this significant conference and for inviting me to participate in this conference. Also, it's important to show some regret that these cyber conditions impeded my engagement in this or participation in this conference from its beginning. It's always sometimes it's important for everyone to be engaged in the conference from its beginning, but we know the impediments and the constraints, especially in my case. Even if there wasn't a pandemic, I cannot come to Palestine for reasons that you all know. So that was just a mentioning at the beginning. Then actually the inquiry that you've just presented was the conclusion of my paper. Who listens to you will think that all my paper is about to tackle these questions. Actually, what I'm going to address, this would be at the end of my paper. My paper is, I've proposed it in light of the title of this conference, When Will the Smile Return to Our World?
مباشرة مثل هذا السؤال.
Directly, it's such a direct question. At least I, and maybe others, would raise a question about when we say when will the smile return, we need to define then when was there a smile, and accordingly I've proposed this title, when was our world smiling. this topic is a key topic, and it's important to address it and discuss it wholly in a clear way. Otherwise, we'd be discussing things in vain or with a clear misunderstanding. So if we need to be sure that we have a full understanding of what do we mean by a smile. And I would like here to start with an important, a famous saying for one of the prominent figures of the French Revolution, one of the contributors, the most prominent in the radical time of French Revolution after 1794, Saint-Just, one of the main figures in the French Revolution. And he's, but he was one among others. And he had a saying in 1794 when the revolution was at its height. He said, and as I remember this important saying, happiness is a new idea in Europe. And this happiness is related to or linked to a smile. Because who is not happy would not smile. So this phrase or statement was announced by him. So when he says happiness is a new idea in Europe, this is an indicator to, or he's pointing to the US that has witnessed a revolution before France, and that revolution in the US had an imprint. However, he speaks as a French revolutionary. And he had this belief. And when he says that happiness is a new idea, means that he's for sure not talking about individual happiness. Individual happiness is there. It's been there forever. But there are people who are happy. But the question is, and collectively, are people happy? And happiness would only be complete when it's collective, happiness of the whole society. And it's important to really put this statement in its context in Saint-Just's speech. He was addressing the revolutionary party. He said, you know that you don't want any oppressor will remain on the lands of France. So let's prosper this happiness. Let's prosper love and happiness. Happiness is a new idea in Europe. So the concept of happiness here is a society that is free of oppression and of misery. Which means, in another word, or in other words, it means that happiness is related to the stages of revolutionary liberation, which create the conditions of happiness when in the majority for this revolutionary liberation and with the engagement of all, when with this majority of the population are optimistic about the future, about feeling happy to get rid of the miseries of the past, then this is where the secret of the smile comes from. It means like as a smile of a society, and as not, this is its meaning, and not a smile of individuals. So let alone the smile of the world, as it came in the title of this conference. So on the one hand, we see that in the French Revolution, there was a moment of happiness in this perspective, through this perspective in the French history. which had prospered to as he wished that after decades in Europe in the middle of the 19th century to what was called the spring of the nations, which is a statement that was followed later, like the Arab Spring in 2011. So it was a revolutionary wave, a revolutionary moment in the middle of the 19th century. And if we want to look at the stages, the global stages of revolutions in the whole world, we will see that the next revolutionary wave was the one that followed the Russian Revolution. However, this wave came in a very dark phase. It was at the end of a very ferocious war. It's the First World War that included a big number of nations. And it was in line, or maybe it was followed shortly by the fascism, and then the world entering into a very oppressive era, which led to the Second World War. So the conditions of global happiness weren't fulfilled or met. So we see that the stages of liberation were on a bigger scale. We need to think after the Second World War and the disarmament of colonization and then the liberation in Asia and Africa in general. That was an era of hope, which then stemmed or came to bring up the third word. And we cannot hide here that this phase in itself witnessed the birth or evolvement of the Zionist entity. But we also know that the building of this state helped in the falling apart of some Arab regimes, which were immediately after the Nakba. By then, we went to a stage that came to its peak at the midst of the 60s and past the century, with the increase of the national liberation movements around the world, and with the continuation and the increase in the disarmament and the resilience of the Vietnamese people, which raised the morals throughout the world of hope. So there were many revolutionary movements, along with a cultural revolution, and then the start of movements against dictator regimes in the Soviet Union or countries related to it. And it was called the Spring of Prague, as it was called in Czechoslovakia in 1968. And quickly, since the 60s, where the 60s was the peak of the economic prosper, which went on around 30 years forward, and then it was the Keynesian system, which held within the content. It's a reform sort of, and it was a sort of like golden age in the capitalism history, because we're not comparing it to gold that goes to the pockets of the capitalists, but it influenced the whole society. In our Arab world, the same era in the 60s witnessed the uprooting of the nationalist movements, like the Nasrem era between the 60s, 61, the convention, and then it led to the 1967, where there was this uprooting phase in Egypt, and then it was accompanied with social reforms and the rising of the star of Nasserisms and welcoming of this liberation in the Arab sphere. By the way, after 2 days, it's the 50th commemoration of Nasser's passing. At the end of that century, we witnessed a new uprooted global movement. We saw that following 1967 and the conquer of Arab countries, which also and one of the prominent results of it is the increase of the evolvement of the Palestinian liberation movements, and which affected the whole area and other youth movements. So this the 1967 generation was deeply rooted. And I belong to that generation. Maybe we had with time we can call it illusions, but they were dreams. Then they were dreams and motivating dreams. So this hope was a reason for our revolutionary happiness, which led to consequently a smile. But if we now tackle our situation now, if we check now our situation and ask when will the smile come back to our world, well, actually, anyone who reads this would think that maybe this is pointing to COVID or 19 or to the economic conflict. Actually, no, smile has been absent for decades from societies. Since the neoliberal curve, and this attack of neoliberal movement that started and which was at its peak in the 80s and 90s. And then the change in the power forces and with the falling apart of the Soviet Union gave big space before the American imperialism to thrive. So also the transformation of Russia to imperialism, capitalism, and also the homogeny in Europe and the competitiveness in different that are not very different. Despite these democratic transformations in some of the countries like East European countries, still it remained in the symbolic framework, but there were repercussions in the patterns or stereotypes of livelihood and economic lifestyle, and the infiltration of fascism, which led to expanding the gap, the social gap, and the wealth gap, which led to this increase or escalation in all phenomena related to this issue. So in addition, all this was reflected actually on an authoritative repercussion as a result of the involvement of extremist, religious or reactionary currents, or maybe the extreme rights wings, or the fascists, until now, as we see with Donald Trump, who who crowned this word repercussion that we can't see a synonym for, except in the fascism era in the 20s and 30s of the past century. Although and I don't want to claim here that our era is similar to that era then. It was maybe more difficult, risky, but still there are many reasons that lead us to be concerned and be very, very concerned accordingly. We have lost this smile, and the world has lost the smile since 40 years, maybe. Since we've entered this after the 60s, when it was like the peak of that smile that was there, that was trying, and then to its fading in the 70s, and then in a global repercussion we're still in, and we're like deep sunk in it, but this does not mean like we're still at the end, the bottom of the ladder. It depends on what will happen later, especially in the United States, since the battle between the rooted populace and the latest battle between Black Lives and Trump and its regime, which is semi-fascist. I think this battle will be really very important, and it will have repercussions on the whole world beyond the United States, in touching the lives of all us too, because of its big economic social volume. So how can we regain? So this is the question now that Jamil addressed when he introduced me. He said, so can the new generation regain the ability to smile and hope? And under what conditions and how? Actually, I would like to say here that there are some reasons for us to be optimistic or to be hopeful. I always distinguish between hope and optimism. I prefer to revert to hope, because I believe that I don't want to prejudge and some conditions to be able to win or not. But there are reasons to be hopeful, because the new generation worldwide, in most cases, we see that these progressive ideas, the ideas that meet in the values that they aspire with the values that prevailed at the 60s with that old generation, my generation. These ideas we witness today, we see that they're prevailing among the youth, even in places or countries where we don't expect for this hope to happen. Just like in the US, if we refer to this phenomenon of Billy Sanders and his representative and his capacity to attract or recruit millions of youth, that was a phenomenon that was worth witnessing. Same in Britain. In Britain, during the Cold War, there were the extreme right of the political world map, and now we see that there's a high percentage of progressive politicization, which is progressive, which I believe, and in light of in this comparative that I tried here to present, it's like it's a reason for hope. However, how can we, or how can this generation propose solutions for smile to replace this misery and depression that is currently prevailing. I think we need to overcome, and it's a basic thing, to overcome the residues of the failure of experiences that the communism have called upon in the 20th of the last century, that led to its falling apart, to its bankruptcy, which left a big imprint that is seen up till now, a big impact. And it's a big constraint, actually, into regaining some sorts of consciousness that would allow to regulate and to have an effective struggle regulation in order to change the world as required. It's required in order to regain this smile, to get it back to this world. All these things need to be done. So at the end, this whole thing is summarized in the capacity of this generation to find some harmony and new way of thinking that would align with this era, and not the prevailing ideology of the 20th century. It should be something that would be that should align with the new era, and to have it and among this pluralism. So values is something very important. It's there's no progressive movement without committing fully to equality, to democracy, and so on. Unlike what we've seen in the past century from things that the communists had called for but did not respect these values. On the contrary, it brought up communities that are contradictory with the values that it called for. So the re-eruption or evolvement of this new happiness, as Saint-Just said, in order for it to come to the front, to be on the faces of the new generation of all of us. So there should be a new ideology in order to create this new happiness. This is the condition, the historic condition for this happiness, to regain happiness to our world. And this also applies to our region, especially our region, as we've seen the Arab Spring with all what it carried along with happiness and hope, and then the repercussion that which showed that the constraints and impediments are so many that it's difficult to overcome them, and the absence of unified values and ideologies that are represented in something in coalitions or something unified entities. But the regulation is what we talk about, or to be organized, regulated. So these are the conditions to transform the new hopes of the new generation to reality, that in order for the smile to light up the faces. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gilbert, for your intervention. We have until now it's 5:30. So the second paper will be with Dr. George Giacaman. He is an academic faculty member in the Cultural Studies and Master's Program at Muwatin Institute and the Master's Program at the Contemporary Arab Studies, and the co-founder of the Muwatin Institute, and he has a number of studies and research. The title, the Post-COVID-19 Arab World. Dr. George, you have 25 minutes. The part of the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, the discussion started on how this pandemic will end, if any. The pandemic has been around, such as Ebola, SARS, bird flu, and different other pandemics have been around. But what distinguishes this pandemic is its spread at international level, particularly its economic impact first, and the impact on healthcare systems, and the expected impact on life at all. So it was not strange to discuss the future and to have expectations based on the results at any given time. Maybe the most important question summarizes all these questions. Will life be natural, business as usual after the pandemic, or will be another normal life? Because for sure, nothing is sure. Yet, the format of this question, as appears in different literature writings, is misleading. There have never been one natural anywhere in the world. It's enough to mention one indicator, which is very indicative to the different aspects of life. And a study that was published in 2013 that the richest 1% of world population, they own 45% of fortune in the world, and that 64% of the world citizens population, they own less than 2% of the fortune at international level. This disparity is there also in the advanced countries, such as the United States of America. We find that 1% of them, they own 45% of the fortune. Fortune is used as a number of financial and other resources, minus loans. This disparity has a clear effect on the different aspects of life, such as health, education, nature of work, and also the life expectancy. Also, there is a number of basic questions around the potential possible conflict in post-COVID-19 world, especially in light of increased poverty, unemployment at an international level as an expected result because of the economic effects of the pandemic. This great disparity on the nature of what is normal, as colleagues mentioned, as a result of certain policies in the neoliberal time that started last century and continues until this day. The title of this period of time is Privatization. The progress of the private sector in different areas of life and the decline of the role of the state, such as in health, education, social insurance, water, electricity, and public services, and the globalization of this model and opening markets to the private sector. It's true the remnants of the old form of the state has different and extent. And especially in the some countries that play a third role to protect whatever they have and rights and social. In fact, the expected conflict started before this pandemic and took a different form, and even sometimes that is not regulated, and which feeds also on racism as fed by President Trump. And due to his personality. Also the paradox in the United States of America and elsewhere that the most affected social classes by the neoliberalism are the important components of the electoral base for Mr. Trump. That they don't have a different economic program compared to the economic policies that resulted to impoverishing their electors. In fact, we find right-wing policies even or worse, as in the case of Trump, as we present about the environment. So this situation maybe gives a new or renewed meaning for the fake awareness for those electing him out of those affected by his policies. And for the paradox that these economic policies adopted by the International Monetary Fund is the prescription for reducing the state expenditure on public services, economic and social rights, and lifting support for economic resources needed by the poor. And it's a paradox that, and with the confession of researchers at the International Monetary Fund, that these policies have proven faulty or failure, and research proved that three researchers, major researchers of the fund, proved that these policies at this globalized capitalism period of time, these policies resulted into increased poverty within the countries and at the world level, in addition to the negative impact on inequalities or increasing inequalities. Although it's difficult to verify in different areas of life about the impact of this, but there are areas where there is a majority of economists about the economic effect of the pandemic. Many of them expect economic recession and globalization, the effect of which will be very visible in 2021 and later. And this will last for years to come. For instance, just to compare, it took 6 years to return to the same unemployment rate in the United States of America after the 2008 crisis. In comparison, the current crisis, some economists, they say this current crisis is much bigger than the 1929. This is in the United States of America. So how important for the Arab world that is already suffering chronic unemployment crisis. Consider that. So it's expected to witness a globalized conflict caused by poverty between those who are willing to protect whatever they have or to return to what they had, especially the globalized companies, and with those who were impoverished because of this globalization and globalized crisis. The Arab world will not be immune to that. So, and in order to respond to these potential risks, we point out to some factors before the Arab revolutions. So this situation has not changed after the Arab revolution, especially in its economic reflections, for reasons that I will touch on later. But we need to go into more details on the Arab situation and to point out to some writings, such as the book titled People Want for Dr. Gilbert Achcar. He is our guest here, but I use it in my classes. And the Achcar report that was published in late 2016. And maybe the title of the book reflects or shed light on injustice in the Arab world. Just a short, for instance, the percentage of youth in the Arab world is much higher than the rich countries. The percentage of unemployment between the age 15 and 24
20 and 24 is around 20 to 24%, according to the ILO statistics. So, and that is the poor, the percentage of poor in the Arab countries is 21.3%, according to the national poverty line in each country. So the percentage of semi-poor or vulnerable to poor, according to the report, is 19.5%. Consequently, the total of the poor and semi-poor becomes 40.8% of the total population. So if, despite this, and if we check the Arab situation as a whole, politically and economically, and with questions. A question. First, who rules? The answer, a tripartite alliance between politicians, security, or the army, and a number of businessmen and women. As for the economy of most Arab countries, it may turn out to be a market economy, and this is in a certain way correct, but it is not a capitalist economy in the sense found in books. That's why it's called the accounting economy, because the clientelistic relationships are an essential part of the structure of these systems, even if the status or degree differs from one country to another. That's why the survival of these regimes requires that they be authoritarian or authoritarian in order to prevent change. These countries do not produce development or job opportunities according to the needs of their citizens of the current globalization. In moderate way, we can say the exception, these countries, they cannot be but authoritarian if they wanted to continue this and even if it was the level is different from one country to another. There is theft that is modest, that is extreme, and so on. So if the global economic crisis will affect most Arab countries, as many expect, including the International Monetary Fund's research department, Gita Gopinath, who said that the world will witness the worst recession since the Great Depression in 1929. And it is clear that unemployment will increase, including among the youth, and the percentage of the poor and the semi-poor exceed 50% in most Arab countries. Regarding their citizenry, but not workers in them from the different countries, even with their citizens are relatively impoverished. Consequently, we will witness social unrest, protests, and strikes in various countries, and it is expected that a third wave of uprisings will begin and that will seek to suppress them in different ways. The Arab counter-revolution since 2018 by the UAE and the Kingdom of Arabia. However, now in an open alliance with the State of Israel by the Emirates at least, and Bahrain. As for Egypt, in particular to Egypt, which would have been the cause of the January 25th revolution and the sacrifice of Mubarak by the army and the United States as well, as a scapegoat for fear of a radical change due to the revolution, it later became the Arab counter-revolution. This grave concern had appeared in the writings of a number of Saudi and Gulf media. in the ratings of many Saudi and Gulf media in general, and in an unprecedented criticism of the United States and how it abandoned its friends, which have provided them protection in exchange for their dependence on it. This was a focal point from the perspective of these countries, and in my estimation, this is one of the main reasons that prompted Saudi Arabia and the UAE to strengthen the alliance with Israel, not only for the sake of the conflict with Iran, but as a base for providing influence within the United States that Israel possesses, for the purpose of creating a greater guarantee not to repeat the scenario of abandoning Mubarak. This was clearly expressed crudely and instantly by President Trump, when he repeated more than once that if they wanted protection, then they have to pay for it. We saw how the payment was done in stages, and it still is. Since then and up till now, the UAE in particular has played an advanced role over Saudi Arabia, and also overtly as the spearhead of the Arab counter-revolution. We have seen this in Sudan and Tunisia in particular, to the point that a member of the Tunisian parliament and the head of the Free Constitutional Party, Abir Moussa, was accused by other parliamentarians of being the representative of the UAE in parliament for playing an active role in the attack on the Islamist party in Nahda. The UAE for years had led an active campaign inside and outside the country against the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamic parties that Obama administration considered moderate because they are the only candidates for power as an alternative to the existing regimes in a number of countries. And while it was possible to witness a third wave of Arab uprisings due to and increase in employment to unprecedented rate in most Arab countries in the coming year and beyond, the Arab counter-revolution will play an active role in preventing change as much as possible. This will be done with possible indirect support from Israel, especially in the case of Egypt. I would refer here specifically because it too is a candidate for an explosion of the situation once again. By the way, for the past 2 weeks, there have been manifestations because of unlicensed homes. In an important study issued recently at the end of August of this year, done by 3 Arab researchers, one of them is Yazid Sayegh, who has a book about the situation in Egypt that was published a year ago. This study concludes, and here I quote, the security and macroeconomic stability in Egypt has been built recently on weak foundations, which reveal its vulnerability, the COVID-19 pandemic. Consequently, has now returned to its starting point in a position very similar to what it was before the 2011 revolution. Stable on the surface, but in the inside, there are deep structural problems and raging social grievances with the exhaustion of everything that can mitigate them. So that was the end of the quote. Consequently, the regime will use the same tools to suppress any possible uprising. Perhaps the UAE and Saudi Arabia helped the regime with generous financial support, as happened after January 25th, even if they were not in the same previous economic prosperity. In the end, the success of any possible third wave of the Arab uprisings will depend on 3 factors. First, whether the army has a fundamental political and economic role in the system that is an interest in not to change. Hence, not like Egypt or Sudan, but like Tunisia. Of course, Tunisia is something to be discussed differently. But but it's known that the army has intervened greatly. Also, at this in same year, the extent to the cohesion of the army, if it launched direct repression, that is like Syria, in which the army remained loyal to the regime. I mean, the upper ranks of the army, so the higher ranks remained loyal to the regime, and this is an important factor. Second, the existence of organized parties and movements that have well-known leaders and specific demands that are not subject to fragmentation, that is, not like Lebanon, or movements capable of quickly forming their ranks, such as the Association of Professionals in Sudan. Three, the third factor, unparalleled goals that seek mainly to change the nature of the regime and not to reach power under the tutelage of the deep state. That is not like Egypt, where the forces of the youth revolution, especially against the Morsi regime, and turned themselves around. They ate the white bull, or shortly after. So after the June 3rd, 2013. Thank you very much. Okay, there's a number of questions that I will pose to you, and some questions are directed to one speaker. So my first question, the first question I received, can we imagine an alternative approach, especially in some areas like Palestine, Arab countries, which means can there be a new formation of the Arab systems without going into civil wars? The second, do you think elections can be a way out of the crisis that the Arab region is facing, especially in Palestine and Lebanon? Or do you think it opens the reproduction or a reproduction of the same? Another question from Mudar to Gilbert. You mentioned the components that would help in formation of happiness, in happying the society, and others that or lead to unhappiness. So since there are things that are opposing, what do you think? What did you mean by it? Another for Shada Hamad. And I'm linked to another question or a comment. Where do we come from with these values? That is there a role for the Arab groups or not, in the Arab world or not? A question about the risks of normalization, like the BDS, for instance. What are the academic dangers and economic risks, although some institutions are being funded by the Gulf states? And what are the risks on the BDS movement? And what is the counter action that is required for this ongoing normalization process? Okay, so I will stop here and we'll take
Maybe we can start with Dr. Gilbert. Thank you. Thanks, Jamil. And thanks for George and for those making the feedback and questions. So many questions and different subjects and so little time. I start with Mother's question that I received in writing first. What are the requirements for structural happiness? I believe what humanity is looking for in its historical context, that as it progresses, it aspires for values. And I related that to your question about values. These are not new values, by the way. The values of freedom, equality, these are all, at least to the origin of, or to the time of revolution, European revolutions. It was basic in these revolutions, these ideas of equality, freedom, and democracy related to these concepts. The problem is not in creating new values, but in finding ideological systems, political regimes that put these values as a priority and or on the lead, and not something that can be dropped or left, because leaving the value of freedom rarely can lead to loss of that, even if temporary, will be all the time. You'll lose that freedom all the time, such as the Russian Revolution that ended with forms of dictatorship that we witnessed. So the temporary will be permanent and led to the failure of the experience. So the basic requirements are connected to connecting the sovereignty of the community over the facilities of the community, and connecting that sovereignty with the meaning of national sovereignty is realized in the sovereignty of the state. And there is another form of sovereignty which is popular, where the state itself will be under the monitoring and authority of the people. And in the 20th century, we saw the first concept that was given the priority, and the sovereignty has always been projected as that of the state, such as the economic sovereignty, which is to move from the private sector to the state sector. But the state sector in a state that is not a state which is subjected to public monitoring control. And we saw what we saw in different forms. There are different forms, such as what was called the USSR context, or the other countries, such as socialists. So the issue of connecting the two sovereignties, when the people takes over the sovereignty over the state facilities, the society in general. So the issue of the state and civil society projects itself as imposing the people's or communities' oversight over the state, unlike to what happened in different countries. And finally, I believe these issues, I have discussed a number of questions, such as the rule and the ruler, and the question about the Arab area. Such a change, as I mentioned, in order to have this without civil wars, there is a need for revolution to break for revolutions to win the support of armed forces. Considering the current benefits, this means the state will use all its forces against the popular movement, even if that resulted in destruction of the country and displacement of the people as we saw in Syria, which is a catastrophe, one of the major catastrophes in the Arab history. Maybe next to that is Yemen, Syria. These catastrophes in size, we used to think of Palestine and the Nakba as our major catastrophe. Now we have other catastrophes. So ghastly and ugly, more than we are used to in the past. Elections cannot be an exit unless they are free elections. And this is a basic condition to overcome reproduction of the existing political structure. And when I say elections with integrity, this means the electoral laws to be enjoying integrity and not devised to simply reproduce the existing regime, such as the demand that we see days in the Lebanon's or Lebanese intifada that are demanding for new elections based on new electoral law. I have discussed the basic issues and the Gulf normalization. This issue has been discussed by George. In fact, these Gulf regimes, the Emirates, and the so-called normalization between the UAE and the Zionist state, I called it as not an event because relations have been there before. The UAE and the Zionist state. And this is a natural state of normalization because the two societies or the two states, the Emirates and the Zionist state, are apartheid states. Apartheid, we know it in Palestine, and Palestinian people, they know that. They know the Zionist structure. And the discrimination, which is well known in the United Arab Emirates, 90% of the population there, they don't have rights. In fact, this is an extreme case of apartheid. Actually, this large number of workers with no rights coming from South Asia. Thank you, Dr. George. I'd like to point out two questions. If we can hold a new meeting, which is the effect of normalization on the BDS. As it is well known, there have been several calls and demands during the first stage. There were calls for a new social contract, regardless of our interpretation for this. But here, it seems that, I mean, these critics are bringing their or coming with their demands from Tahrir, such as social justice, living 3 or 4 words, either freedom, dignity, and social justice. Regardless, these slogans, all of them, and thinking with each word, you can easily think of economic and social policies as a translation for these statements. And this is the interpretation for a new contract. And the literature about the political change, such as in Latin America, we find that there are different factors that can facilitate the success of revolutions without any bloodshed. One of the factors mentioned by Dr. Gilbert, which is winning the support of armed forces. And we saw the case of Syria. If armed forces and security forces are not ready to support revolution, the revolution cannot succeed. In Syria, also, we see a proxy war within Syria. So the role of armed forces is important. The other factor that can contribute to change is if there is a breakaway or division within these forces. Here I'm speaking about some conclusions related to the ensuring the success of revolutions without any bloodshed. The third factor, which is the belief or conviction to give concessions, big or small, instead of losing everything. Maybe there is some proportional success that can lead us to some political change. But it is difficult to say about the lack of any revolution. Take, for instance, revolutions in Europe and different countries. In 1848, they failed and ended by the time and turned into gradual reformist track. It's true that the French Revolution is developed one. It took several years because at a certain stage it returned to the empire state. It's difficult to define the factors this way, but we will witness a third round of these changes. What's happening in Egypt now? There are revolutions in different cities. For 2 weeks, we saw that, but it's not in Cairo or Ismailia so far. But in my view, this is not the beginning of a new uprising, but indicators indicate to that trajectory. As for normalization and relation with it, the problem of normalization is that the situation of the Arabs and the Palestinians is the weakness and the division, but I don't believe there will be any effect for normalization on the Palestinian situation. That is, if the Palestinians succeed in transforming this state of affairs or projecting this situation as a racial discrimination, then focus will be much more on that regardless of the normalization situation. The reason for that the factor is that there is only one state, which is Israel, where half of the population are Palestinians in historical Palestine. And there is an existing racial separation or apartheid regime, be it with the use of resources, legislation, situation. Now the question, how can we shed light on that, highlight it to the world? This is a battle that might require several years. But I believe there is a need to give up the illusion of the possibility of the two-state solution with the Palestinian understanding to that two-state solution as Pan-Palestine without sovereignty, without Jerusalem, and without any contiguity, and call it a state. In fact, it is an autonomous rule, that's it. Many people, many factors depend on the success of the Palestinian side, internally and externally. And this effort must start, and this way there will be no much effect of normalization on the Palestinian situation.
Thank you, Dr. George. No time for other questions, but Dr. Muda, there's a request to have other sessions to discuss these papers that were presented in this session. There are many comments and observations on YouTube, so we'd like to have some chance to interact with the speakers in some other time, probably, or maybe in the coming few weeks, if possible. You can promise them, yes, there will be. Mustafa Khawaja has asked this question. So now we have Samuel Moyn with us, Dr. Samuel.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. So now with Samuel Moyn, the history instructor at Yale University. He was teaching history in Columbia University and law and history in Harvard. He has many interests in the European ideology, especially in Europe, Germany, and he is the editor of Humanity magazine. He has a number of publications. To some could be provocative, but these critical writings remind us of why did we concise the human rights, and although we neglect the bigger picture of social and human justice. And his paper is titled "Human Rights in an Unequal World." You have.
All right. Well, thank you, first of all, for the invitation. I hope that I'm audible. I would like to share my screen, but it says that it's been disabled, just because I think it might be helpful.
You can share now.
Okay,
I enabled the.
Okay, it works. I'm actually going to substantially repeat what the prior two speakers said, but what I'd like to do in charting our descent from happiness into neoliberalism, to look at it through something I've tried to write about, which is the history of the global idea of human rights. And so I'll try to take, no more than 40 minutes and, be glad to hear your observations and reactions. I'm really going to try to summarize a recent book I wrote called "Not Enough Human Rights in an Unequal World," and I'm going to begin where that book begins, with a Czechoslovak dissident named Zdeněk Tominova. She was the spokesperson for Charter 77, which was one of the first self-styled human rights non-governmental organizations really in history. And it emerged after the Helsinki Accords in 1975. And she paid a price for articulating the importance of now international human rights standards against her Czechoslovak state. For example, at one point, she had her head pounded into the pavement because Charter 77, which famously included the playwright and future president Václav Havel, was such a threat to the regime. Tominova took a trip at the invitation of the Czechoslovak government in the late 70s and gave a speech in Dublin in 1981. And when she championed human rights to a Western audience as an Eastern dissident, she offered a warning. She said that she had appreciated the coming of socialism in Czechoslovakia and even the communist regime when she had been a young girl, because it brought social leveling. And the idea that some, on the basis of their families and wealth, got more privileges than others ended. It was true, she acknowledged and insisted, that the idea of socialism had, in the meantime, decayed. It became an alibi for the denial of precious human rights, like the right to speak or criticize government. But she warned her audience that there was a reverse danger, that the idea of human rights could become an alibi for the abandonment of socialism, where she hoped to see the ideas come together and not forget equality in the name of liberty. Well, sadly, she was cruelly disappointed. This is an engram. Google allows you and I to generate them very easily. And what they do is allow us to track how frequent words and phrases are in various languages. And in all the languages that Google allows us to track, I don't know Arabic, so I haven't tested it, but I've tested many others. The idea of socialism, as you can see, was much more popular for most of the 20th century than the idea of human rights, or at least people said the word socialism much more than they said the phrase human rights. But then something remarkable happened. Just at the moment this Czech dissident spoke, the idea of socialism began to collapse. And at the same moment, the idea of human rights began this meteoric rise, which has defined our time. Very interestingly, you will see that the lines cross around 1989 at the end of the Cold War. And it's made it the case that we could be all together at the 26th anniversary conference of a human rights center at a Palestinian university, which would have been unthinkable absent this development. How do we think about the relationship between human rights understood as a body of national and international norms and the egalitarian politics and promise of socialism? Well, that's what I want to think about today. I'm just going to, let's say, bracket or cover very quickly that there's an immense debate about how we should think about the history of human rights, which I'm happy to come back to. There's no doubt that the Atlantic revolutions, the American and the French, also the Haitian, later the Latin American revolutions, made human rights a widespread ideal. But as I've argued, mainly in let's say a nationalist spirit, or at least a statist spirit. If you were an advocate of human rights before our time, it meant that you wanted to found a state for your nation, much like Palestinians eventually have tried to do against so much resistance. It's true there was a universal declaration of human rights that the United Nations propounded in 1948, but note how little comparatively, and this is in all languages, I assure you, that the idea of human rights gained traction, became popular in the 1940s. Indeed, that was the height of the nationalist moment in world history because of decolonization. And indeed, the Israel-Palestine conflict has its inception not at that moment, but the Nakba does because of the collision of two aspirations to national control of territory. What is amazing, and I want to come back to this, is that out of all proportion to the modern past, let alone the human past, it's only as a result of some mysterious events in the 1970s that the idea of human rights became our credo, or the credo of many. And I think we should have a debate about why that happened and what its consequences were, good and bad. And today I'm going to address the relationship of this event to socialism. So I want to say a few prefatory things before I tell a story with 3 stages about how we got to our present. I'm just going to, as background, remind you that Karl Marx argued in his youthful essay on the Jewish question that human rights should be understood as bourgeois interests, not as universal claims, but rather an ideology of the interests of the bourgeois class. And in doing so, I want to say he argued in one respect very persuasively that we should think of all of our ideas, including our reformist aspirations, as having some connection to the economy or mode of production, the way we choose to organize production, exchange, distribution. But he concluded about rights that we should regard rights as inflexible. They're necessarily bourgeois concepts, and they're unsalvageable. They can't be used for other emancipatory purposes, because he claimed that rights were merely about political emancipation rather than human emancipation. And while acknowledging part of his view, I also want to challenge, just on the basis of the history since, his understanding of the inflexibility and unsalvageability of rights. So I am going to proceed through these 3 stages, roughly the 19th century, the mid-20th century moment of national welfare states, and then our neoliberal time. But before I do, let me just introduce one further distinction. It comes from contemporary moral philosophy, but I hope to show you that it should be useful in understanding what's been involved in our transition from welfare happiness to neoliberal human rights. And it's a distinction between sufficient provision on the one hand and equal distribution on the other. The idea of sufficient provision says that there's a line or a threshold that defines how much individuals deserve, either of money, as in a universal basic income, or of the basic decencies in life, like in a list of rights to housing and health and food and sanitation. Now, that's a very important moral ideal, sufficient provision. The question is, what is its relation to a rival moral ideal called equal distribution? Because they're not the same. One is about bringing up the worst off to give them a floor of protection. The other is about making the rich live amongst the rest of us by building a ceiling on inequality. And note that you could argue that that if you provide sufficiently for each individual, it doesn't matter how rich the rich are. Already in 1796, in the midst of the revolutionary decades, actually in a critique of the first communist, who was named Gracchus Babeuf, the Englishman Thomas Paine said very directly, it doesn't matter how rich the rich are, as long as the poor are raised out of poverty. But many people in modern times have said sufficiency is not enough, that we should also care about living together, not in hierarchy, but in at least a relatively egalitarian society. And so if that's true, it very much matters that there's a ceiling of distribution and not just a floor of sufficient provision. So I want to start my three-stage story. The first stage was that of 19th century capitalism. And what I want to say about this stage was that when it comes to the idea of rights, of human rights, Marx was on very firm ground. If you believe he was mistaken, he came by his mistakes honestly, because if you look out, the idea of rights is very closely linked to the advancement of the wealth and power of the well-off, because especially when it came to legal enforcement and judicial protection, rights mainly accrued to those who cited freedom of contract against state intervention, and sacrosanct property also against state intervention. It was an anti-redistributive idea and an anti-statist idea. And no surprise that the results empirically in this period in many countries in the heyday of capitalism was an unregulated form of markets that led both to immense poverty in an era of extraordinary growth, and to inequality, where the growth accrued mainly to the very wealthiest, not just within societies, but globally, because 19th century capitalism was a global imperial phenomenon that immiserated many parts of the world or kept them poor through extraction and enrichment of the rich. And so if you stopped the film in the 19th century, it does seem that in spite of other ideas about rights from the French Revolution through the 19th century, that in practice, they have the function of defending the interests of the wealthy. And the results are that the poor suffer and that the rich gain in relation to the rest. That changed after a lot of struggles in the middle of the 20th century, when we have, just to generalize very broadly, the coming of the aspiration of the national welfare state, or even national socialism with a small n and a small s. The idea of the 20th century state was that it would intervene for the common good, both to regulate work, to regulate production, and to provide more equal distribution than before. It did have provisions for the worst off. And it's at this time that 19th century proposals of economic and social rights, like the right to work or have a job, the regulation of how the workplace is set up, but also ideas that the state should be a welfare state, providing health and other services to all its people. These ideas get canonized, notably in many constitutions after the Mexican Constitution in 1917. The way these new welfare states work, though, is that they also involve enormously high taxation on the rich and force egalitarian outcomes. So from the perspective of my two ideals, sufficient provision and egalitarian distribution, where both had been neglected in the 19th century, both are honored together in the middle of the 20th century. Now, there was still a debate about whether the idea of rights was salvageable for social reform. As you can see on my slide, even a liberal like John Hobson could say, almost no one believes we should use rights to provide welfare. But the fact was that rights proved both flexible and salvageable, and many states, many welfare states, deployed them to try to bring about sufficient provision and equal distribution. Now, note that these were not perfect states. We should not get nostalgic about them because of their exclusions. For one thing, it was empires that did most to build welfare states, but they did not include their imperial subjects within them. And so welfare states were bounded national projects. They were not global, and they were exclusionary externally for empires. But they were also exclusionary inside, especially when it comes to women, but also any racialized citizens. And of course, that remains today, but it was especially remarkable in the middle of the 20th century. It's worth noting at this conference that that the idea of a welfare state was a nationalist aspiration in so many of its iterations. Sometimes an ethno-nationalist one, as in the pioneer Adolf Hitler, but also in left-wing versions. I would include in that the National Socialist ideology of activists and politicians in places like Israel and Palestine, who tried to take the revolutionary ideal of the 19th century and infuse it with a nationalist political project. My point for now is that the idea of rights kept up and could be an idea that made sense within the welfare state. As you might expect, one of the great theoreticians of the welfare state who actually talked about rights in his work, T.H. Marshall, used the metaphor I used in the beginning of the talk in explaining what the point of the welfare state was, and therefore of social rights. It wasn't just to build a floor of protection for the worst off, although it was supposed to have that function. It also was intended, at least, to erect a ceiling on unequal distribution. And you can see why he thought that when he said that that the welfare state would create an egalitarian outcome. It did at that time. And in theory, you might assume that if you build a floor, if you give more things to the worst off, only the rich can pay for it and will necessarily descend. And so sufficient provision and equal distribution will necessarily go together. That's what Marshall believed. If you want, if we had more time, we could get into it. I think it's very plausible to read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that United Nations announcement of our rights of 1948, as just an emanation of the National Welfareist Project, which was socialist in so many of its guises around the world. The goal was not to create international rights protection, and no movement for trans or international rights protection emerged at that time. Instead, it seems like the Universal Declaration can be best understood historically as a charter for national welfare, and thus connected to sufficient provision and equal distribution as goals. So it's no surprise that the second half of the Universal Declaration includes economic and social rights that we still care about, like the right to work, the right to health and housing and food and so forth. But I'm suggesting that in its time, it actually was connected to a welfarist politics that was nationalist and egalitarian as well. Well, I think it's worth mentioning that because of the imperial setting of world politics in the 1940s, it was of great concern to decolonizing leaders to elevate these ideals to the world stage, to internationalize them. After all, as I said, the 1940s left the mass of poor people in either the position of imperial subjecthood or in new states. And the most galling thing for the leader, the successful nationalist leaders of new states, was that decolonization actually led to the augmentation of global inequality. So one of the most striking and tragic aspects of history after World War II is that even as in welfare states, the gap between the rich and the rest diminished, in global terms, the gap between the wealthy white populations of the global north and the global south increased in terms of income and wealth. So what I think is crucial to remember is that it was really the nationalists of the global south who internationalized a lot of moral principles, and in particular that of the egalitarian agenda of the welfare state. You find this most clearly in the new international economic order proposals of May 1st, 1974, in which a group of 77 insisted that equality matters not just within states, but among them. And some at this time began to speak of what they called a welfare world. And so in our time, we mostly think of the world as a space for humanitarian action to remediate global poverty. That's a problem of sufficient provision. But we should never forget that egalitarian distribution was the highest hopes of post-colonial nationalists themselves. They didn't get their wish. The new international economic order proposals were beaten back, including by Henry Kissinger and so many Americans. Instead, we have our neoliberal era. And in the conclusion of my talk, I just want to sketch how we should think about the relation between human rights and neoliberalism. Because I showed you at the beginning that we're living in the time of human rights. And of course, that is the very same era, as my colleagues who spoke before me said, of the victory of the rich. So how do we connect the facts that on the ruins of the welfare state, human rights came to the fore as moral ideals in a neoliberal era? Many people are asking this question. I'm just giving one answer. And so I want to make a few preliminary observations first. One is that it's very interesting to me, at least, that if you ask people what human rights are, they will not say they're the interests of capital, as Marx thought, and remain true, as I suggested in the 19th century. They're about free speech, freedom from torture. Maybe in certain radical contexts, they'll say that human rights are about collective self-determination, and we can get into where that norm fits in human rights politics. It's not true that that there wasn't an internationalism in our time that's about the victory of the rich, but it's mainly in other international institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which don't say they're promoting human rights. Structural adjustment was not done in the name of human rights. So it remains very important that even in a neoliberal period, human rights remain a reformist cause. Second, human rights have been bound up with a huge emphasis on what I'll call status equality. I mentioned that the welfare states were still patriarchal and racist, as all states still are. But we've seen in our time a very big concern, feminist and anti-racist, to treat everyone equally, no matter what kind of person they are, no matter what race, gender, no matter their disability, indigeneity, sexual orientation. And human rights as an international cause are very closely associated with campaigns for this kind of status equality. All I want to insist is that that's not the same as distributive equality. Globally in our time, women have gotten more equal to men, although they're still not treated the same. But rich women in many places are less equal to the rest of women in a country like mine or many other countries. So the campaigns we have for status equality don't exactly correlate with distributive equality. It's also true that in the long run, human rights has gotten associated with sufficient provision. So in the beginning, in the 1970s, international human rights movements ignored economic and social rights by and large. But today, they're pretty important for advocates pursuing in various contexts those rights to sufficient provision, like the right to housing, the right to food, and so forth. What I want to claim is that in spite of all these facts, human rights are not about material equality. They're not about the difference between the rich and the rest. So the key from my perspective is that we think of human rights as trying to establish, along with many other forces, a floor of protection, but it's without any ceiling on inequality. And I suggest that makes the human rights movement of our day and the human rights ideals many of us care about, connected to the economic framework, the neoliberal one of distribution, exchange, and so forth that we have set up. Now, to substantiate this for you plausibly, we'd have to look at a lot of places. We'd have to look at each national setting, since what we call neoliberalism came to the world in stages. First as policy in 1973 in Chile. It was reserved for my country and the United Kingdom to the turn of the 1980s for Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan to bring it. In Eastern Europe, neoliberalism obviously waited for 1989. Each place is different. A place like Israel nearby has moved from socialism to neoliberalism, and its own internal class hierarchies have expanded enormously in between the 1970s and today. And then once we reckoned with each nation, we'd have to look at those international institutions I mentioned, like the international financial institutions to determine their role. But to cut a long story short, what I want to suggest is that we're living in what you could call Marshall's nightmare. T.H. Marshall, that English sociologist, assumed that if you built a floor of protection, you would automatically get a ceiling on inequality. But that's not true. And actually, we've seen that the reverse is happening in our day. Anti-poverty has succeeded not just as a moral concern and a rights concern, but as a successful campaign beyond the wildest dreams of any reformers in history. But it's occurred at the time of an obliteration of any constraint on economic inequality in many national settings. I think the signature of our age economically is provided by China, whereas many of you will know the marketization of that country since 1981 has led to the redemption of more than 700 million human beings from extreme poverty as measured by the World Bank. That's about $1.50 per day. But at the same time, China's internal inequality class hierarchy has expanded more rapidly than in any country in world history. And that includes much more rapidly than in my own country, the United States, where we've given up any modicum of distributional equality since the 1970s. So to conclude, my thesis is that human rights fit in a neoliberal world because at their best, if they engage distributional concerns at all, they focus on a floor of protection. They do not allow us to target a local or global inequality as an independent concern. And where prior ideologies, notably socialism, were very threatening to neoliberalism, human rights are not. Because if you like, human rights, while they're working on the floor, can allow neoliberalism to obliterate any ceiling on hierarchy and inequality. You may ask, in relation to the history of the Palestinian struggle and so many others around the world, what are the politics, as happened in South Africa, of redescribing what was a struggle for national liberation as a human rights movement? Well, I leave that to you, but it seems to me to be very fateful that human rights as an idea have fit relatively comfortable in our neoliberal world. So my own conclusions from, if you believe what I've said, are twofold. First, it doesn't suggest that we should give up the idea of human rights, which are good things, especially as some of the prior speakers remarked, in an age of populism and nativism, which so often takes exclusionary and racist form. You know, it's really nostalgia for the welfare state, which was a welfare state for white men. And yet, even if we defend human rights, we can argue that they're not enough. And we have to return to that moment when Zdena Tominova, the Czech dissident, insisted that we embrace human rights only alongside a more ambitious politics. In her case, and mine, if you want to know, it's a socialist politics. And this, to conclude, is for two reasons. First, sufficient provision is not all there is to our moral obligations. It's important, but egalitarian distribution also matters morally. But even if you don't agree, you can see in many places around the world that under conditions of economic inequality, those who stagnate choose to scapegoat victims And it turns out then that the human rights of the vulnerable and weak may depend on more equality for the middle class relative to the rich. And if that's true, then on strategic grounds, we should also make sure to put human rights in a larger package of goods, especially in electoral politics, but also thinking internationally about the global alternative that a populist barbarism seems to be to egalitarian or even socialist politics. So I'll stop there and thank you very much. And I believe I've left a little time for any chats or objections that people want to have.
Thank you, Samuel. I'm not sure. I think there will be no space for debate, unfortunately, because the conference was designed as such that the keynote speaker will we will finish the conference with your speech, but I'm sure that we will have different forums where we'll be able to invite you and
good.
with you, your thoughts, your presentation. I'm sure that we will have in the near future enough space to contact you and talk to you about your insightful thoughts.
Very good.
Thank
you for having me. No, thank you for having me.
Thank you. اوكي بهذا ننهي المؤتمر. هذه كانت الكلمة الاختتامية. أود في النهاية فقط أن أشكر فريق معهد مواطن خصوصا
Muwatin's team, especially those organizers who have worked behind the scenes. Haya, Shadi, Joyce, Ahmed, Ahud, and Hani, and Diala. And I would like to thank the speakers, the chairpersons of the sessions, and the translators, Mary and Mahel. Thank you. And the editors, Zaina Zarur and Abdurrahman Abu Shammal, and the public relations at Birzeit University, the IT, Tariq Amin, and of course, Heinrich Böll institution that supported this conference. I hope I did not forget anyone. Okay, so he's reviewing who else he might have forgotten. Designers as well. And so I just the concluding speech was to someone. We hope we see you at the next conference inside Birzeit University campus. Modar, would you like to say a final word? Thank you, Jamil. Actually, you said it all. you even talked on our behalf. But let me just reconfirm our promise. We in Muwatin, we consider ourselves we're an institution of organic thinkers, and we believe that the dialogue within the society is very important and not on the fringes. And we think that it's very important to open the horizons in the university and open the doors and everywhere. And I hope we can continue these discussions and debates in an open discussion. I've seen some of this discussion on YouTube. There are more questions when we talk about the left in Israel, or however it would be an colonizing left. So there are many questions that came up about the Palestinian nationalists. It could be leftists. So there are questions, very big questions that call for to conclude other forums. And the conclusion out of these 3 days in this conference, I think there's still horizon for hope, and there is hope for a smile in the future, and that there is this spirit of a very strong humanitarian spirit that seeks to reach equality